Good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome to you. My name is Jade Steen. I'm Engender's Communication and Engagement Manager. We're really delighted to bring together so many of you for today's event around policy, prevention, and violence against women and girls. The focus of today's webinar can be a difficult subject. We're not planning to discuss any specific incidents, but we recognise we're all coming to today's session with different experiences. So please do take care of yourselves this afternoon. We'll pop some helplines in the chat throughout the session for anyone who feels like they may need further support. We really welcome the large number of you who have signed up for this event today. Collectively, this really reflects and we recognise the vital importance that policy making and prevention play in tackling violence against women and girls. Today's event uses Zoom's webinar function, so you are unable to turn your camera or your microphone on and we can't see you, but you are very welcome to engage in the Q&A chat function. Questions centred around the topic of today's discussion, of course, and I know many of you have shared questions prior to today's event, and we will be answering and sharing those, so thank you very much for doing so. For now, that's enough from me, and I'll pass over to my brilliant colleague, Engender's Policy Officer for Delivering Equally Safe, Hannah Brisbane. Hannah, over to you.
Thanks, Jade. I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. So yeah, thank you everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us, especially if it's as sunny where you are where it is here this afternoon. As Jade said, my name's Hannah and I'm Engender's Policy Officer for our Delivering Equally Safe project, which this webinar is a part of. So for those of you who don't know, Delivering Equally Safe is the Scottish Government's funding programme for third sector organisations and public bodies that are contributing to the delivery of Scotland's violence against women strategy, Equally Safe. So today's session, we're really grateful to have such a wide range of attendees with us, either watching now or if you're watching back on the recording. So we recognise that some of you might be coming to today's session with lots of knowledge about violence against women, or lots of knowledge about public policy and policy making, or some of you might know a bit about both. So whatever camp you're in, we're really glad that you've decided to join us this afternoon, and hopefully there'll be something that everyone can take away. I'm going to start just with a quick overview about Engender's Delivering Equally Safe project before we hear from our two fantastic speakers. We've got Emily St Denny from the University of Copenhagen and Maïna Coroller-Larifla from Sustrans Scotland. And as Jade said, there will be a bit of time at the end for questions, so please do feel free to pop any that come to you in the Q&A box as we go. So the reason we're here today is because violence against women and girls continues to be one of the world's most pervasive human rights violations. In Scotland, this violence continues to occur at endemic levels, and I've put a few statistics on the slide here which demonstrate this. Although it is worth pointing out that this type of violence is massively underreported. Globally, less than 40% of women who experience it will seek any support from services, while less than 10% will go to the police. At the same time, all forms of violence against women and girls intensified during the COVID-19 pandemic, and the cost of living crisis that we're going through at the moment is continuing to exacerbate this issue. As many of you will know, this is an issue that the Scottish Government and local authorities in Scotland have committed to tackling through the Equally Safe strategy, which is Scotland's strategy for eradicating and preventing violence against women and girls. So this was originally published in 2014 and updated in 2016, and the strategy sets out a vision for a strong and flourishing Scotland where all individuals are equally safe and respected, and where women and girls live free from all forms of violence and abuse and the attitudes that perpetuate it. So Equally Safe has been commended for its world-leading boldness in its analysis of men's violence, and this is because it's one of the few strategies in the world to outline women's inequality with men as a cause and consequence of violence against women and girls, while also highlighting the need for social change to end this violence. And this understanding of gender-based violence as a function of gender inequality and an abuse of male power and privilege is directly derived from the United Nations Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, which states that violence against women is a manifestation of historically unequal power relations between men and women. So this means that gender inequality, and specifically women's inequality with men in this context, is a main cause of violence against women and girls, and vice versa. So the two issues very much feed each other. In Scotland, gender inequality continues to be pervasive, and it manifests itself in many different ways. So whether that's harmful gender stereotypes, which tell us boys will be boys, or systemic gender inequality in the labour market that gives men more access to power and resources. And all of this inequality is creating the conditions for violence against women to be perpetrated, but also tolerated. And at the same time, gender inequality and violence against women can be further compounded by multiple intersecting inequalities, so such as race, ethnicity, disability, sexuality, gender identity, class status, immigration status, just to name a few. And again, all of these different manifestations of inequality are contributing to an environment in Scotland where that violence is being enabled. So for some of you, this might be the first time that you've heard this analysis. And when I've given a version of this presentation in the past, people have sometimes asked me about things like alcohol or football matches. And these are things that can receive a lot of attention, particularly in Scotland and in the media, as being causes of violence against women and girls. And while it's true some of these things may exacerbate violence or increase the risk of it occurring, gender inequality, men's abuse of power, and misogyny remain that underlying cause of all forms of violence against women and girls. And these things should never be used as excuses for men's behaviour. And again, this is very much the analysis that has been adopted by the Scottish Government and COSLA in Equally Safe. So another key component of the Equally Safe strategy is its commitment to primary prevention, which is about stopping a problem before it occurs. So this is a term borrowed from public health approaches, which typically outline 3 different levels of prevention. The first being primary, followed by secondary prevention, which aims to identify and address an issue as early as possible. And that's often linked to early intervention responses. And then tertiary prevention, which is about reducing the harm and consequences of an issue, preventing recurrence. So in this context, primary prevention is about stopping violence against women and girls before it has the chance to occur by addressing the root cause, which we've established is gender inequality. And this primary prevention approach is described as being a core objective of the Equally Safe strategy. And the Scottish Government states that it aims to change societal attitudes, values, and structures which produce inequality. And they recognise that this will require determined effort over the long term. So again, this commitment to primary prevention is something that has been commended. However, in the years since the launch of Equally Safe, key organisations in Scotland's women's sector have identified a critical gap within this approach. And this is a lack of clarity on how primary prevention should feature in public policy development in the Scottish Government and beyond. And this is significant because public policy affects pretty much every area of our lives, whether that's our healthcare, education, public transport, and so on. And because of this, it does have the potential to be a really powerful tool for promoting gender equality, and thus creating that environment in Scotland that is hostile to men's violence instead of the current one that's enabling it. However, this primary prevention approach is not being consistently operationalised in the Scottish Government and in Scottish policy making. So we're missing vital opportunities to prevent violence against women, and in some cases end up enabling it instead. So to give you one example, in 2018, the Scottish Government published its Ending Homelessness Together high-level action plan. Historically in Scotland and the UK, housing policy and homelessness policy has been viewed as a gender neutral policy area, meaning it's not typically been framed as a women's issue in the same way things like childcare, the gender pay gap, or men's violence have been. And in addition, our policy responses have typically centred around rough sleepers, which is more commonly men's experience of homelessness, whereas women will tend to rely on statutory services or informal temporary accommodation arrangements, like staying with friends or family, to avoid having to sleep rough. And in addition to that, women's homelessness is commonly driven by their experience of gender-based violence. So again, there's a vicious circle happening between women's inequality and violence against women and girls. And that's starting to take shape in this housing policy area. And yet the 2018 action plan, it didn't include a gendered analysis of homelessness, and it failed to set out actions which would prevent or disrupt that reciprocal link from taking place. And again, this was published in 2018, so after Equally Safe had been in place for a few years already. So that's the motivation behind Engender's Delivering Equally Safe project, because we know that public policy can be a really important tool for addressing gender inequality and preventing violence against women and girls. And the aim of our project is to support policymakers to reach that potential. So no matter what area of policy they're working in, they're taking these issues into account. Ultimately, what we want is to develop a tool for change that will support this type of primary prevention approach in policy. And we really want to hear from policymakers as we start to develop this and think about these ideas to make sure that what we're coming up with is credible and achievable. So today's session is very much intended to be an introduction to these ideas about the role that public policy can and should play in preventing violence against women and girls. So later, as I said, we'll be hearing from Maïna from Sustrans Scotland, who will demonstrate the importance of applying a gender lens in transport policy, which is another area that is often regarded as being gender neutral, but that actually has huge implications for women's equality and safety. But first, in just a second, I'm going to hand over to Emily, who will be providing just a bit of an overview of policy making at the moment in Scotland and what that looks like and how gender factors into that process. And again, just to remind you, we'd really encourage you to drop any questions that you have in the Q&A box. And if there's any we don't get to today, then you can feel free to follow up with me via email, or if there's anything else related to our project, do feel free to get in touch to discuss this with me. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass over to Emily. Thank you.
Hi, let me share my screen and hopefully this will work and the presentation will be, there we go. Hi, everybody, I'm Emily. I'm from the University of Copenhagen, but I actually worked at the University of Stirling for a really long time, and I specialize in public policy and particularly prevention policy and policy making to reduce inequalities, particularly health and gender inequalities. So that's where I'm coming from today. And I'm going to go quite broad into gender equality policy in Scotland. I think you'll see why it has to be broad, but hopefully it's useful as a way to give everybody a little bit of something that might be interesting to them. So I thought the most important place we could start by is essentially saying that it's really hard for anybody to definitively give you an assessment of how well we're doing in Scotland. In some ways, Scotland is doing really well, but in some ways we're still lagging behind, and some of the numbers that Hannah showed you with regards to violence is evidence of that. And that's where I'm going to start from. Essentially, I think a useful point of departure is to consider all of the things that go into structuring or shaping gender inequality or gender equality. And that's where I was asked to talk about maybe the Scottish government and what the Scottish government was doing. But actually, I don't want to talk about government today. I think that the term governance is more helpful, because rather than thinking of there being a sort of finite number of people at national level who are responsible or capable or in a position to do anything about this, governance really highlights the fact that gender equality is shaped by plural actors across different sectors. So of course, we're talking about the government, but we're also talking about the private sector, and we're talking about the third sector too. And also, these actors are really complexly organized across different territorial levels, which I think is something that's also very clear in Scotland because of the devolved kind of situation, but it's true everywhere else as well, because you have often a national level, but you often have a subnational level with local authorities, and oftentimes there's some supranational level as well that may not have, ever since Brexit, for example, there may not be direct authority from the EU into matters in the UK, but there's still organizations like the United Nations that are kind of setting out norms. Hannah was talking about some of the norms that can be generated, some of the definitions, some of the early understandings of these issues come from the top down to us as well. So using the term governance, I think, allows us to see that there's no one person or no one lever in policy or policy making that is the kind of magic lever that if we were simply to find it and push it, we'd be able to solve essentially a structural issue. What we can see in Scotland is clear political commitment to the question of gender equality, i.e. improving gender equality or reducing gender inequality. And there are different types of factors that people would point to prove that we do care about this in Scotland at a very high level and across lots of sectors. So we talk about distinctive policies. And Hannah's entire specifically designed to tackle this issue. But that's not all. We have, for example, the Period Products Act, which is, world leading in that regard. So there are things that Scotland does before other countries that does better than other countries, and they're very visible and we talk about them a lot. But there's also machinery. So Scotland has tended to have either more or less, and the shape changes, but we tend to have something called gender equality policy machinery. That is to say, offices or branches of the public sector or individuals whose job it is specifically to keep an eye out for this. And the names of these things can change, but oftentimes it's a minister who has gender equality as part of their portfolio. We also have the National Advisory Committee for Women and Girls, all of these different organizations. It can be an office as well. And we also see relatively consistent political rhetoric across most of the sector. So for example, it would be seen as aberrant if anybody from any of the political parties, for example, were to say that, no, we don't need to improve women's participation in formal politics. Generally speaking, everybody in politics in Scotland has tended to go in the direction of supporting more from women or less violence against women. Exactly what they mean by that can change, but broadly there's consistent political rhetoric. So with that in mind, I think it's really important to remember that, especially with structural issues, it's not going to be just about the policies that are adopted, but also the processes by which we come to make those policies that is going to matter. So essentially, gender equality is not a function of just gender equality policy, but also policy making practices that are compatible with reducing inequalities or unfair inequalities. So in that sense, we need to talk about policies and policy making. And here, there are also things that happen in Scotland that are compatible with the reduction of gender inequalities. For example, more so than many other countries, there's been a sustained interest in gender budgeting practices. That is to say, essentially the application of a gender lens to the allocation of resources at a national level, for example. We have a commitment to feminist foreign policy, which again is the application of a gender lens to foreign policy decisions and actions. But also more generally, some of the ways that the Scottish Parliament, Scottish government interface with each other, the way in which they interface with other actors, such as local government actors or third sector actors, that are part of what we've come to label as something like the Scottish approach to policymaking, i.e. how we do things in devolved Scotland, tends to feature greater consultation, perhaps more co-production, definitely more partnership working than other places in the UK like England. And those in themselves are more deliberative, perhaps more egalitarian, are open in that sense to more gender equality compatible processes or practices. The issue remains, though, that much like what Hannah was saying, gender equality is a structural issue. So despite all of these efforts and despite sustained political consensus, we still haven't managed to achieve anything close to gender equality. And I live in Denmark, and people usually hold the Nordics aloft, but we also have the Nordic paradox, whereby we might have reduced inequalities in labor market participation, reduced inequalities in the gender pay gap, and we still have extremely high levels of violence against women and girls. So it goes to show that even the countries that we hold aloft as kind of the shining beacons still have a lot of work to do. So it seems to be that it's not necessarily a lack of political commitment, it's probably something else. And that's where my work tends to come in. Considering gender equality as something that is structural, I would think really shows us that there's no magic bullet situation for this. We can't find a single lever that we can pull and suddenly everything works, because essentially all policy has an effect on gender. Hannah was giving the example of housing and homelessness prevention, and then we've got an example about transport as well. So all policy has an effect on gender, but not all policy is made with gender equality in mind. And so what we can also see is some of the big examples that we hold up as really progressive in Scotland were actually passed not necessarily because they were attractive as gender equality policies. That might have been the case, but if I use the example of the Period Products Act, it was actually more successfully kind of sold as a solution to poverty more generally. So not even necessarily gendered in that sense. It was a kind of gender neutral-ish sense of anti-austerity, anti-poverty. So lots of things are happening, even in those policies that we're kind of associating with gender equality. They're also anti-poverty policies. They're also pro-environment policies. They're also good transport policies. And so ownership of that kind of issue can be tricky as well. So when it comes to Scotland specifically, I tend to suggest that we can look at the challenges that we're facing. Originally, I'm going to say in 2 ways, and then I'll show you why it's actually in 3 ways. So essentially, there are certain challenges to making gender equality in policy in Scotland that are specific to Scotland. And then there are those that are universal to gender equality policy or policy making anywhere in the world. It's the reason why no country has managed to do well. And it's all of those things that Hannah said. It's essentially the pervasive nature of gender inequality, of the patriarchy, of misogyny, and all of that. So you can have specific situations in Scotland, perhaps, you know, the fact that we tend to prioritize certain types of political debate over gender equality, and then you have universal ones. But generally speaking, what you'll tend to have is things in the middle of that. That is to say, generic difficulties that we're going to look at afterwards. The reason why universally it's hard to reduce gender inequality that take on a very specific form in Scotland because of its particular politics or history. So there, I think I want to raise 4 challenges before concluding. I frame them as challenges because I don't think they're unsolvable. But they're the things that tend to come up when we study why gender equality is out of reach at the moment in many countries. The first thing is that gender often comes second. So essentially, in the event that there's a political decision to be made that trades off between 2 sectors, for example, the economy and gender, then gender tends to lose out. So gender is something that will be acted upon if it doesn't jeopardize other big macro level decisions, usually the economy. And the issue, you know, that raises, other than just being kind of counterproductive, is the fact that it's really tricky to get right, because even if we were to increase the amount of attention we pay to gender, if we do that in a way that is not also sensitive to other types of social injustice, we probably won't fix gender equality, because actually you also need to be tackling all the other forms of injustice. So as long as they're also not being prioritized, we probably won't move the needle that far. Secondly, you have this cluster, which is kind of complexity and multi-level governance, and that essentially I would summarize as the fact that central government actors either want to believe or genuinely do believe that they have more control over the issue than they do, when actually power is shared in really complex networks. And here, if we just use multi-level governance as an example, so the fact that we share political power above the state and below it, you would think that, for example, Brexit might simplify the situation for Scotland because it would remove a level and therefore reduce complexity. But actually, a great deal of gender equality policy came down from the EU. So not having the EU anymore as a level where we can debate things, where we can form coalitions, where we can take direction from other countries is not necessarily going to mean a massive improvement for gender equality. It might actually complicate things. So just removing a layer of governance doesn't necessarily simplify that issue. Then we have the fact that gender equality requires policy coherence, and you might agree that gender equality is good, but they may not agree on what exactly gender equality is. Does equality simply mean anti-discrimination legislation? Does it mean redistributions? Does it mean making specific rules for specific groups? And that ambiguity, rather than seeing it always as a bad thing, can be a good thing. Ambiguity means that at a high level, we can get everybody to agree that gender equality matters. The problem is when it comes to actually designing implementable, deliverable, fundable interventions, people might start disagreeing, because that's when money has to change hands, that's where rules and prohibitions need to come in, and people don't always agree on that. And I think around all of this, we also shouldn't forget the fact that we're making processes in the institutions that we're operating in, whether they're public, private, or third sector, they are gendered, so they are reproducing gendered patterns, but they are also feeding them back into the system. So in that sense, a lot of the progress that we've made might be tricky to chart, because it's unclear whether our processes are set up sustainably to produce progressive policy, or whether it's just been a few people who have been particularly interested in driving this agenda, who have done so. And if they were to disappear from politics, retire, move to another job, whether that dissipate, right? So whether the fact that we're doing quite well overall compared to a lot of other countries is down to the fact that generally we've set up good institutions and good processes, or whether we've been relying on too few people essentially to keep driving this forward. So if I were to conclude about this, I would say that we can definitely point to a consistent political commitment to gender equality or reducing gender inequality, especially at a rhetorical level. And oftentimes it's easy to say that that's not enough, and it's not enough, but it is still better than nothing. By and large, we don't have to renegotiate every day the importance of reducing gender inequality, which I think is important. The issue is more often on the political agenda or on the wings of the political agenda than it would be in many other countries, including some within the United Kingdom. We also have some very visible areas where Scotland is a leader when it comes to poverty, when it comes to taking a stand on feminist foreign policy, when it comes to trying sometimes to flirt with the idea of gender budgeting. But overall, it'd be hard for anybody to give you a very strict verdict on how we're doing, because we don't know if what we have really amounts to feminist governance. For example, is gender equality something that has to be driven by people who are avowedly feminist, or is there another way of doing things? And oftentimes it's just pointing back to this gap between rhetorical commitment and actual policy action. And generally, the reason why we seem to be held back are the same challenges, but with a kind of Scottish spin as other countries. So we're not more special or more different than other countries. Essentially, we tend to not prioritize gender unless it really isn't going to cause a problem for essentially the economy or other types of entrenched interest and processes that come to support those. And then when we do work on gender, it's very often kind of simplified or reduced down. Instead of taking a really transformative approach, we try to make sure that it's something that we measure, that we keep on top of, that we bureaucratically manage, that we have checklists without necessarily thinking about the processes that those checklists fit in and whether or not they're capable of actually dealing with structural issues. There's also the question of what Scotland is. After more than 20 years of devolution, it's still really hard to figure out what policymaking in Scotland is and what's going to stick and what's not going to stick over time. Whether or not we have institutions that have been set up for sustainable progress, and we can hope to see nothing but progress, slow but steady progress out of gender inequality, or whether we've relied overly on the leadership of certain parties or certain actors at different times, and if a change in those patterns would bring, for example, backlash. And I think the question of sustainability is really important, because we know that rights can be lost, right? So if we look at feminist foreign policy as an example, Sweden was essentially the country that coined that approach and that term, and the current Swedish government has already basically disavowed this, right? So just because one person or one government or one party says that they are pro-feminist foreign policy doesn't mean that the next one necessarily will. So there's everything to be lost as well there. I do, however, think that there are areas that are specifically Scottish in that sense of strength and opportunity. Firstly, the partnership working that does exist, which is imperfect in many ways. We can do a lot of things to make it go worse, but at the same time, if we recognize that certain aspects of it are working, we could also nurture it. And here, I think it's important to remember that a lot of feminists and a lot of gender equality activists are skeptical of the state and actually much prefer to work outside of it. And a lot of the good ideas for reducing gender inequality do not come from within the state. So making sure that there are bridges and there are relationships between these different groups is really important. And the fact that, generally speaking, in Scotland, we've tended to talk about inequalities, whether they're gender or other, and the fact that these are not mutually exclusive. So it can lead to certain types of competition where groups are saying, well, we need to solve, economic inequality first and gender will come later. But actually, it may offer an opportunity for us to realize that all of these issues are interlinked and we could create more effective coalitions. But there, again, the kind of specificity of what we mean by gender equality needs to be negotiated and made really clear at the beginning. Otherwise, we'll fall into that trap of not really knowing how to act when we finally get the opportunity to. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Emily, for that really interesting presentation. And I'll pass over to Maïna, who's going to be talking about gender and transport policy.
I just sharing my screen. Hi, so thank you for inviting me, Hannah. That's a great opportunity to talk about transport and gender in transport policy. So first of all, I just want to introduce people to SaStrans because I'm not sure you all know the organization. So we are a charity that is developing active travel infrastructure. So in Scotland, we have 4 main programs. So we have the Places for Everyone program that provides funding for projects to create healthier places and which aims to increase the number of trips made by walking, railing or cycling. We also promote and develop the National Cycle Network in Scotland. And we also have a street design program. So that's an award-winning program that is trying to help communities improve their living places. And we also provide support for schools in terms of providing resources for teachers to help their students cycling. We also have the Hands Up Scotland survey every year to check how many students are cycling or walking to school. And the reason why gender is very important to our work is because we do deliver transport infrastructure, and one of our aims is to be for everyone. So first, I'd like to talk about gender and transport planning, which, as Hannah and Emily have said, is a policy topic that is seen as non-gendered, but is very much having an impact on how women live their everyday life. So we know that transport planning does not always take women's needs into account because it does prioritize men's needs. So when we look at how transport is planned, it's mainly focused on commuting routes and those routes that go from the suburbs to the city centre for people commuting during peak hours, which is not always convenient for women because of the gender division of labour within households. Women are more often likely to be in charge of childcare or just care or household duties, which means that they will have to do multiple trips in a day. Sometimes they will need to, for example, I don't know, drop a child to a school, then drop another child to another school, but the routes don't necessarily cater for those needs. And then, so in terms of what we would recommend in transport planning is to not only plan for peak hour travel. So when we look, for example, at bus routes, it's really hard to get 3 buses in an hour if you need to take multiple buses, or if you have different bus systems, then it costs more, which again has an impact more on women than anything else. We would also recommend to reform the transport sector in Scotland because we know it has very little women, again, only 6% in senior positions. But we know that just having more diversity in the sector is not enough. We need to have training on what the needs of women and girls are within transport. And as I've mentioned, prioritizing routes that focus more on the local area rather than just from the suburbs to the centre for commuting is very important to ensure that women's needs are accounted for. In terms of active travel, which is what we deliver, we know that as much as we're trying to be for everyone, walking and cycling cannot always be for everyone, and women are less likely to walk and cycle than men. Again, it's very difficult to fit walking or cycling into household routines, very simply because, as we know, having children has a strong influence on how women travel. So public transport with small children, it's very challenging. If you have a pram, if you have 2 prams, for example, also very hard. Walking with small children or just as a woman, we know the pavements are not always accessible. They don't always feel safe. It's not always well lit. And we know that women are more likely than men to change their routes due to feeling unsafe, which again impacts the transport mode they can and will use. And physical concerns around physical and sexual assaults are one of the biggest deterrents to walking and cycling, especially after dark in the winter month, especially in Scotland. So I moved to Scotland about a year and a half ago, and I was very surprised in the winter when it gets dark at 3 p.m. and it doesn't really encourage you to go out if the pavements are not well lit. And then one last thing on active travel that I would like to touch on is the perceptions of femininity in public spaces. So as much as we try to encourage women to cycle more because it's good for your health, it's net zero, it's a great transport mode, there is also that perception for women that they need to look a certain way when they arrive, for example, at work or just when they go out in town. And having those expectations is also a safety concern. So for example, if you need to wear heels, how are you going to cycle? How are you going to walk? So this is all of that a deterrent to women traveling more actively. So for that, what we recommend when we have projects is to always have inclusive streets and inclusive design. So that means always try to involve the community in the design of their streets. And it's always good to have as much diversity as possible in your consultations, because then you can be sure that you cater for the needs of everyone. In terms of physical interventions for safety, so as I've mentioned, lighting is a big one. Then it's very much urban planning jargon, but we need clear sight lines, which means people need to see on the streets where they're going and what is coming their way, more importantly. Segregated cycle lanes. So we know that women are more likely than men to report near misses with drivers, even though they are more careful on the road. So that sort of main violence against women, even as cyclists, can be not stopped, but lowered by having those physical separation between a cycle and a road. And then obviously I want to talk about social interventions, because we can have as many physical interventions as we want. If we don't change mindset and how people act in the streets, how men act towards women, it's a bit all for nothing. So we need to ensure, first of all, that there are behavior change campaigns towards men. So I'm thinking about this campaign, for example, Don't Be That Guy, where he was basically encouraging men to tell their friends off when they were harassing women on the street. But there's also things like bystander training that can be done in community centers. So it's to empower people to act when they see violence on the street. Then I would just want to touch on our work in Sustrans, on what we do to improve gender equity. So currently we are doing a review of the EQIA process. So EQIA is equality and equality impact assessment, sorry. So they need to be done when we have a project that will impact on the built environment. And so because we deliver those projects, we have to do them. And we are currently developing a new tool to enforce that, to ensure that these assessments take into account not only gender, but also race, disability, sexuality, gender reassignment, etc. Because sometimes they can be seen as a sort of box ticking exercise where we can see, yes, it's not going to have a big impact on safety because we've asked a couple of men, but if we don't have the views of everyone, as I've said before, this is all for nothing. I don't think it's all for nothing, but it's not going to be as thorough as it could be. We're also currently working on a report on gender budgeting in active travel. So Emily touched a bit on that. And we are going to look at how to introduce gender budgeting in active travel planning and how it can be applied to our projects. But it will also have recommendations for how local authorities can do that, how Transport Scotland can enforce it. So it's really exciting. It's a really good draft. I can tell Engender when it comes out and they'll probably forward it to you. And finally, we're also trying to include more of gender audits in our work. So I have 2 case studies after that, but basically it's to ensure that in every project we have a gender perspective and that we focus on the safety aspects. So I have 2 examples of that. So the first one is the project in George Street in Edinburgh, which is part of the City Centre West-East link. So they've worked with Atkins, a consultant, to refine a toolkit that already existed that was called the Walking Route Audit Tool. And the new tool is called Getting Home Safely, and refines the category that already existed to make sure that it's more nuanced and more accurate to the needs and feelings of women and girls. So there's 6 themes that they've used, and and mainly refined because the 3 of them were already existing. So the 3 existing one were landscape, infrastructure, and human presence. So landscape obviously is just how the street looks, but it also they refined it to make sure that there were no hidden corner, for example, and that things that can look nice sometimes have an impact on women that we can't see. So for example, if we have those big planters with trees, you can see it's really nice, it adds some life to the streets. But then when you look at it more closely, you can see that it's also a space where you can't really see behind. And so that was a safety issue for a lot of women and girls. So that's how they refined the tool. They also have on this tool, so human presence, which is natural surveillance, to make sure that there are eyes on the street, because you feel safer if you know there's people around that can record what happened to you or that can intervene in case anything happened to you. Then the new criteria that they added was digital, so make sure there's data coverage in an area, that you can use safety apps, which again is very sad because it's sort of that view that you need to protect yourself, but it's also a way to make sure that if you need, you can call for help. Then the community side of things is to have positive behavior campaigns around the street, and Love My Street is to create a feeling that there's a belonging in that street that would sort of lower violence in the street. So how does that work in George Street? So first of all, they did desktop research to understand the street. So they looked at the map, they went on Google Maps to sort of look where would be the areas where there would be tensions in terms of safety. And then they did audits during the daytime and at night to really understand how the feel of the street would feel, because a lot of the time audits are just made during the daytime, and then at night the feel and the perception of the space just changes completely. And after that, they had a couple of advice and opportunity to increase safety. So for example, importance of human presence on the street. They also recommended to introduce additional lighting in certain areas, such as bike parking, because as we said, we encourage people to bike and cycle, but then if you have to park your bike in a very dark space, you don't feel safe, so you don't want to bike. So then you go back to taking the bus, maybe several buses to get home. And one of the last advice they had was to engage with community group to provide a sense of ownership of the space. So maybe work with artists artists just to make it feel nicer. And then the other case study I have, so that's one in Wales that we have, but the findings of that study are being used currently on some projects in Scotland. So that was a path that was away from the road, that was not really well lit, and there was a history of documented assault on women. So the team in Wales wanted to redesign the path. So what they did is they did workshops with women only to understand what their needs were, what the safety fears were, and then they redesigned the path to account for all of that. So some of the findings were that in that path, for example, there was a lot of spaces where you couldn't see the exits. So it was harder for women to feel safer being on that path and knowing that if anyone was behind them or in front of them, they couldn't avoid them. So they've redesigned that. And then the next step is to build that path and then do follow-up research to understand if the physical changes have had an impact. So the process is already being used in Scotland in other projects, as I've said, where they work not only with women, but also with people from the different protected characteristics. In, for example, Winchborough, they've taken the approach to do a survey of the population in the street, see if there's any issues related to any protected characteristics, and then do workshops with people with those protected characteristics to understand how they can make their space better for them, so more accessible or more safe. So that's me on sustainable and transport planning. I'll just finish with Some reading recommendations, if you're interested in transport planning and how we can include gender in it. So Feminist City by Leslie Kern is a very good book about how cities were mainly made for men. And I know that in Glasgow, they've recently passed a motion about Glasgow being a feminist city and embedding gender equality in their planning policies. I also recommend Mobility Justice by Mimi Shala. So it's more about how transport and traveling is very much dividing along gender lines, racial lines, but also class lines. And then finally, Women and the Man-Made Environment is also a very good book about planning and gender. So thank you for your time.
Thanks, Maïna, for that really interesting presentation about everything that sus trans are doing in the different projects that you're working on. It was really useful to hear about those. And I think those are two really interesting presentations about the importance of applying gender analysis and policy making and policy making in different environments as well. And that's a really important consideration for us as we think about gender equality being used as a tool as part of this primary prevention approach. So I think we're going to move on to questions now, and we've had a couple in the box, but if anyone else has any, feel free to keep adding them. And we had a few submitted beforehand as well. So I'll just double check in the box. I think we've got a question for Emily, which says, I think that there needs to be a fundamental change in mindset from the top government right across policing and the criminal justice system, which no longer treats violence against women and girls as just another type of crime. Do you think extreme misogyny should be treated as a form of terrorism?
That's a really interesting question. So I probably I'm the wrong person to answer that specific question about whether it should be treated as a form of terrorism, in the sense that those are kind of legal classifications that have to do with also how people are treated and punished by the criminal justice system that I do not specialize in. However, I think the overall point makes me think of two things. And this relates back to some of the other things that Hannah was saying earlier, which is the difference between something being gender neutral and something being gender blind. Sometimes movement away from something where a particular group of people is considered differently and given different rights is a bad thing, but it can be a good thing. And it's hard for us to know which one. In this case, I think it's probably a bad thing, but it's masquerading as a good thing. So essentially, a lot of the time when we can do transport as well, we say it's gender neutral. But if we think of gender neutral as something that actively mitigates against gender inequality, then it's actually something that would consider gender. Gender blind is actually when you don't consider gender to be important at all. And I think that's kind of what I'm getting from this question is, to what extent should gender be used as a lens through which to understand certain types of victimization and the treatment of certain individuals? And I think that it's absolutely clear that gender is, an integral factor in violence, whether that is specifically gendered violence and extreme misogyny, or just the way that different people experience violence as well. So we have I'll give you an example that it doesn't have to do with maybe the typical types of violence against women and girls that you think of, but political violence against women. So that's harassment or violence against women in politics. And even there, a lot of the people who are studying it say that it's important, of course, to recognize and classify when women politicians are being harmed physically, but also when they're being harassed economically and so forth. And they also say that sometimes something can happen and the person there's no evidence of this person harming the female politician because she is a woman. But the way that it is received by the rest of the female population as threatening makes it a form of violence against women. So it goes to show that gendered aspects of violence aren't just in terms of motivation, or in terms of even the types of victimization that is exerted, but also just in the way that other people, even those who are not the primary victim, feel about it. And I think there, with the type of fear that can generate in a person or in a group of people, it has parallels with certain types of terrorism, for sure.
Thanks, Emily. And I think that question really goes to show the importance of the way we frame issues as well, and who gets to decide the way different terms are used and the different way policies are framed. I know in my work, I've been looking at like planning policy, for example, and the framing of safety within that, and who decides what safety means and what does safety mean for different people. And we had the new national planning framework released this year from the Scottish Government, and there's a whole section in that about health and safety, and not once is women's safety mentioned within that. It's more related to hazardous chemicals and things like that, whereas we know that violence against women is a really key safety concern for women, obviously. So yeah, I think that's really interesting issues to consider as well. We had a question submitted before during sign-ups for, I think, Maïna, around concern about public safety on psychopaths and what policing is available. I don't know if you want to discuss that, and also maybe some of the other things that Sus Trans are working on around safety in that relation.
You just repeat, it was safety on psychopath and what?
What policing is available.
Okay. Well, I'm not an expert on what policing is available, but we know that on psychopath, what is very important for women and everyone is just to have a separated one from the road. In terms of public safety, what is important is, as I've said, to have very clear sight lines in terms of design and also clear lighting. Because I think it's in North Edinburgh, there's a path that is quite nice. It connects the whole city, but it's really dark at night, so no one really uses it. Well, no women that I know would use it, which is really bad. In terms of policing, again, this is not my area of expertise, but it would be the road police that just takes care of it, and it would be a case of just reporting it, which isn't ideal because we know sometimes they're quite far from the road, so there's no surveillance and there's not always CCTV. But it does not mean that it should discourage women from cycling, because I think sometimes being scared of something means that there's no one on the road, and it's when there's humans and when we all together that we are stronger, and then safety becomes a thing, and that is apparent there.
Thank you for that. So we also had a comment in the question box just saying, as a from Councillor Jules Bell, Angus Council, saying, as a councillor, I'm shameless about using my position to make wee inroads where I can, but councillor pay is impossible for younger women, especially with families to live on. It's not accessible for a more diverse representation, which is why it's still preserved for a particular demographic. It's not in their interest to consider these things, as the operating arm of government. Local councils have real power to deliver on these policies, but that impasse needs to be smashed. With only about 29% of women councillors, it's a really toxic environment and getting harder to convince more women to participate. Work in progress. And definitely, I think if you've not checked it out already, Engender has our Making It Happen campaign, which is all about getting more women into local councils. I think we'll maybe post a link in the chat about that. Because these are, I think that shows them in this project. Yes, there's an aspect that's going to be about gender mainstreaming and bringing together tools like gender budgeting and gender safety audits that Maïna was talking about as well. But also what we need is that systemic change to happen as well, to go in line with this around, well, why aren't more women getting into politics? Why aren't there more women in policy making and decision making roles? And how can we improve gender competence across these institutions as well? So what we need is definitely these tools, but that systemic change to go along with that as well. And I'm just looking at my other questions that we had through. So we had another question in the sign-ups about what steps can be taken to ensure that policy around violence against women and girls is evidence-based and informed by the experiences and perspectives of survivors and other stakeholders. So I don't know if either of you have experience around making around centering evidence-based in policy making, and also that inclusion of experts by experience as well.
I can say something. I work a lot on evidence-based policy making, and I think what most people who work on public policy would say is that the closest thing you will get is evidence-informed policy, because you never remove the politics from policy making. So all we can hope is that the kind of scientifically informed, rigorously tested information gets through, but it's unlikely that we would ever end up in a position where we followed exactly what science was doing. One, because science is not finished, and two, because in a democratic system, we have made space for other values than science. So I think it can be a little bit frustrating when we consider, or if we really think of evidence-based policymaking as some ideal that we're falling short of, rather than thinking what is the space of evidence versus, for example, the experiences that you were talking about, which is not scientific evidence, it's experiential evidence. And clearly there's a space for that as well. And so I think having a conversation about what kind of policy we want, what space we want for numbers, for different kinds of scientific data, and then for experiences or for values and norms and all of that, I think that's how we solve that problem, rather than kind of consistently just trying to shout science to policymakers whose job actually is not necessarily, or who don't view their job necessarily as being technical reporters of scientific journals.
Maïna, I don't know if you've got anything you want to add around how we can make policy and then make sure that experts by experience are included in that process as well. I don't know if you've done anything sus-trans around that.
So I know we have been on the committee talking about how women and girls could be more included, for example, in physical activity, and around there was also some questions around safety. And I think on that, there are obviously, like Emily said, evidence is key to having good policy, because that's what you need to base it on. You need to base it on facts. But on the other hand, having those live experiences also helps with reaching people and making it more understandable, more tangible, more real. And so that's why having, for example, the testimonies of girls saying, well, I started cycling and that was really good for me. Okay, that wasn't safe. We did something with friends. That was really nice. Is also helping in getting the message across.
Perfect, thank you. So we're fastly running out of time this afternoon. So if anyone does have any other questions, as I said at the start, feel free to get in touch with us.